Today's podcast is supported by Winston and Strawn LLP. Winston and Strawn, a trusted legal advisor and advocate for clients across virtually every industry. Designated is proudly supported by Hummingbird. Hummingbird is a modern compliance platform designed to make financial crime investigations smarter, faster, and more effective. Because today's financial criminals are sophisticated, savvy, and agile, meaning the tools used to fight them should be too. Learn more at hummingbird.co. I'm Yaya Jata Fanusie, and this is Designated on the Illicit Edge Network. The Silk Road, the digital one from a few years ago, you may have heard about it. Beginning in 2011, it was a darknet market that sold all types of contraband. But in order to buy illicit items on this Silk Road, you had to use this new thing at the time called Bitcoin. Perhaps you've heard of that. But in 2011, Bitcoin was still in its infancy, and this illicit activity on the Silk Road really put crypto on the map, especially for law enforcement. But by 2013, the Silk Road was shut down as part of a federal investigation involving multiple law enforcement agencies. Key to the disruption of the Silk Road was an undercover special agent with the Department of Homeland Security. The name of that agent? Der-Yeghiayan. His story is not very well publicized, but he sat down to talk with me about what happened behind the scenes of the Silk Road and how he and a team of his fellow agents were able to gather evidence and conduct a raid that brought down the creator of the site, Ross Ulbricht, who went by the moniker Dread Pirate Roberts and is now serving 2 life sentences in a federal penitentiary. Now, there's a bit of a free Ross movement in some circles, pushing to commute his sentence or to even pardon him. This interview with Jared Der-Yeghiayan doesn't aim to take a point of view about his conviction, but rather to lay out the facts from the perspective of the agent who went undercover and worked with Ross on the Silk Road and played a key part in bringing him to justice. I hope this conversation will help you decide what you think. Time to get designated with Jared Der-Yeghiayan. You told me recently that you had an event, I think last week, that I think maybe says a lot about you. What in the world did you do a few days ago?
Uh, it's hard to talk about, but I ended up finishing one of my big races for the year. So I did an ultra race that was in like Midwest Virginia in the mountains, and I did complete it. And so I'm pretty happy about that. But it took me about 29 hours to complete.
So what is that, an ultra marathon? What could you describe what that was?
Sure, it was a ultra marathon race. It was they say it's 100 miles, but it ended up being about 107, which doesn't really sound like 7 more miles is that big of a problem. But when you're moving as slow as you are, and you're as tired as you are, and hungry as you are, those extra seven really matter.
I think that says a lot, Jared. You've got an amazing story. I think we should start with your own origin. Could you tell us a bit about your family, your background?
I'm Armenian, half Armenian, I guess, and other half is just a good mixture of American, different immigrants that came in. So my father immigrated here in the 70s and met my mother and got married in college. And his background being Armenian, the family had a rough past, with the Armenian genocide, and he ended up actually being born in Syria because of it. And family was grew up in Syria, and then eventually he moved to Lebanon with his family and grew up there playing soccer, and that's how he came to the United States, was on a soccer scholarship, and where he met my mother in college, and and yeah, the rest is really history.
And then, so where did you end up growing up?
So he ended up getting a job with Department of Justice as an attorney, and with Immigration Naturalization Service, and he was a trial attorney and ended up getting assigned to Chicago. And so we grew up in the north side of Chicago, in a suburb about 40 minutes from the city.
We're going to get into your government career, but I know it started way back. Um, Tell me a little bit about why you went to CBP, Customs and Border Protection.
I didn't really go to CBP. CBP sort of came to me. Um, my father being immigration, I was applying for different federal jobs. This is right before 9/11. It was actually 1999 was when I first started applying, and I was looking at jobs primarily trying to get into Secret Service. I guess like the whole idea of like jumping in front of a bullet or something was appealing when you're 19. But at the same time, I didn't really know what I wanted to do except for just to get into federal law enforcement. And so I applied with Secret Service, and I applied with U.S. Marshals, and I applied with Immigration Naturalization Service as a special agent. And the one that came knocking first was INS, which is Immigration Naturalization Service. And they ended up offering me a job as an inspector in Chicago, which I not traveling internationally hardly at all growing up. I really had no idea what that was, but my father convinced me it was the greatest job ever, and so I took it, and I found myself then instead of really jumping in front of bullets, stamping passports.
So you're stamping passports, you're young, a sense of adventure. So at this point, were you disillusioned, or how did you feel?
I felt like it was not exactly what I envisioned for law enforcement or for my career or really what I was going to do in my life. And I still really wanted to do something within law enforcement that was a little more sophisticated and interested in investigating different crimes. And but I learned a lot actually through that job, and I learned a lot about people and learned a lot about nationalities and different types of like trends and patterns and identifying those and ticketing and the way that you talk and interview with people was something that I felt if I never really had those skill sets, it would have been really difficult to develop them as an agent or anything else that I want to do later in my career. And so it was actually really beneficial. And I stayed in that job for about 7 years and doing a variety of different things, not just stamping passports, but also I was on a counterterrorism response team. So we were actually responding to people that were high risk for terrorism, interviewing them, and then at the same time I was also going after narcotic smugglers and primarily at Chicago O'Hare International Airport.
So I always find it interesting talking to folks who were in government, going 20 years plus back. You were, I assume, at CBP, it sounds like, during 9/11. So how did that affect you?
Actually, no. So it the typical government setup. I applied in '99.
Mm.
I didn't get in until 2003. It took that long. So there was a hiring freeze, which is what prevented. So 9/11 happened essentially right in the middle of all these applications, and at that point in time, no one really knew what was going to be happening with the different agencies. And that was about the same time when you're talking about Immigration Naturalization Service, which was originally under Department of Justice. It was identified as being one of the failure points for 9/11, along with Customs Service and FBI and the various agencies that just weren't sharing intelligence or information. There was a really good actual book from the whole 9/11 commission. There was actually a separate book that was the travel and trends, which I found to be actually way more interesting than the commission's report because it actually talked about all the different hijackers and how they came into the country and where they were at, and actually broke down what they said during their interviews and who was waiting for them outside the airports. And it's actually a really it's very very well written. It's a lot of documentation, and it gives you a lot of insights. And that was something that pinpointed, the failures in how immigration wasn't talking with customs and how the different intelligence agencies weren't talking together with different law enforcement. And so that was primarily, obviously, why Department of Homeland Security was stood up and why INS was eventually dissolved and became, well, in typical government fashion, they took Immigration Naturalization Service and the Customs Service, two different agencies, and to make it more streamlined, they made three agencies. So that,
Typical US government
yeah.
efficiencies.
So when I went to the academy in 2003, even though I was hired by INS, and I was hired as an inspector. We had no idea what agency I was going to be working for when I left there, because there was ICE that was being created, which is Immigration and Customs Enforcement. There was CBP, which is Customs and Border Protection, and then there was CIS, which is Citizenship and Immigration Services. And they didn't know which one we are going to be a part of. Like when we're even going through the academy, they're like, I don't know, when you get out of there, you're going to be part of one of them, or we think. And so we actually still wore our Department of Justice badges, and we wore the patches, the Department of Justice patches, for like another 2 years into 2004, 2005, until they started identifying themselves as being CBP. And we all eventually got like the same shirts and the same badges working at the airport.
You went on to DHS, Department of Homeland Security, and you joined something called a HSI, which I don't think a lot of people know about, especially the idea of there being agents at DHS. Could you explain your journey there?
Absolutely. So they, in this confusion of forming three different agencies, both Immigration and Customs Enforcement, or sorry, I guess both INS and at the time Customs Enforcement, they both had officers and they both had special agents. So they had criminal investigators and then they had the regular officers. What they did is they ended up taking the two officer corps from both agencies and combining them. That became CBP, and that's what you see today at the airports. And they're the ones who are wearing the blue shirts with the badges and the uniformed officers. And they're also made up of a border patrol now too, is a part of them too. So that's all under CBP. The special agents, though, were combined into one agency called ICE, which we're familiar with more for the immigration side of it, because there was also the enforcement angle um, of the whole INS component of going after people that were either like absconders or people that were in country that were illegal, and there was a totally separate component of ICE. So anyway, so there's two different divisions of ICE, and one was the criminal investigators that investigated all the crimes, and another one was the like sort of immigration enforcement angle. And HSI is that criminal investigator side of it. They're the ones who are the special agents that traditionally came from customs and from immigration, INS at the time. And so they're referred to now as Homeland Security investigations.
So tell us about your role in HSI and maybe some of the initial work that you did.
So when I got on, they were they still, I mean, they fall under the umbrella of ICE, so they're still part of ICE, and what they do is a really wide range of different criminal investigations. They do everything from narcotics to human trafficking, human smuggling, financial crimes, and they have a cyber component going after child exploitation. That's a really big aspect of their investigative core. But they have a lot of statutes that they cover, because being two different criminal investigative agencies, they derive both of their authorities and powers. So the agents that are under HSI have a lot, and they break them down primarily in their different field offices to those different sort of core fundamental programmatic areas. And the one that I was assigned to was actually just a sort of catch-all, and it was the office that was dedicated to supporting anything criminal really that was coming out of Chicago O'Hare International Airport. And they called it like a resident agent in charge office. So that's where I was assigned to begin with.
So what were some of the first cases that you dealt with?
Everything from there was a drug called COT at the time, so KHAT, and there was a lot being smuggled through O'Hare in cargo, and passengers bringing in their suitcases just filled with this stuff. And if you're not familiar with it, it's a drug that acts a little bit like amphetamine or like speed. And if you've seen the movie Black Hawk Down, this is what people were chewing to like stay up for like 72 hours straight and fighting, without any rest. And so this drug is smuggled in abundance into Chicago. And so some of the very first things that I worked on, and I worked on primarily as an officer, and then when I became an agent, was criminal cases against those that were responsible for smuggling it into the Chicagoland area.
Hmm. So one of the things that sort of came on our radar about your work is undercover work, and a lot of people would be surprised that there's an undercover component to HSI. So could you tell us about some of the undercover experiences that you had?
Yeah, I there's the traditional undercovers that those guys that, are the biker gang type of thing that, work really deep undercover. You've seen Donnie Brasco, those type of things. And you think about that, you're like, wow, that's really hardcore. And being legacy customs and being involved in the narcotics trade, they did have a lot of traditional undercovers. A lot of people that would work in that capacity that were either trying to infiltrate narcotic, organizations and other people that are involved in like the smuggling of goods and services. And so there's people that really go deep undercover, and they have a pretty elaborate setup with and a program that goes back for decades on working undercover in the physical form. But they really hadn't touched on too much of like the undercover online. They were doing it with child exploitation, but it really wasn't something where you it became like a full-fledged sort of undercover role.
So it sounds like you started to do some different type of work. How did you get involved in the cybercrime side?
Again, that just like sort of this job in Fine INS sort of came to me. This landed in my lap as well too. I'd never really envisioned myself working on cyber crimes, and even though I felt like I had a little bit of an understanding of online activity and working online, and I was uh, active in different forums online, before working for Homeland Security, and so I had some familiarity, but I wasn't really like a tech savvy type of person. I couldn't code. I didn't really take any classes in coding or understanding necessarily like anything in too much depth, and so I didn't really think I'd ever be involved in working in cyber crimes. But there was a trend that we started noticing in the summer of 2011, which was coming through the mail unit of Chicago, and it was small drug parcels that were coming through in letter class mail, and we were finding small amounts of ecstasy, small amounts of LSD, and it appeared to us at the time as it was coming from an online website because it was coming from packages that had pre-printed labels, and it was all coming from like the same type of like receiver or sender, but going to different types of people all across the United States. And it was all printed labels, which in our experience, typically that's what like an online store would do because it's more of a business and it's just an operation, and they just print labels out and they put them. It's not going to be sitting there someone writing it, by hand and sending, a small amount of drug from a friend to a friend or something. Or um, so it really appeared like it was an online website, and the officers pointed out to me, and it was something that I started investigating, and it led me really quick in a few different types of interviews to it being from this website called Silk Road, and I learned that this Silk Road operated on this thing called Tor, and it was using this thing called Bitcoin, and I had no idea what that was at the time. I actually had to do my own research at the time and figure it out because I hadn't heard of it even in our training. I hadn't heard about it, and through other investigators, and it wasn't something that was on our radar.
So explain exactly what is Tor.
So Tor is the onion router. It's essentially a like a program, if you will, or a configuration that you could do to your computer when you're on the internet to anonymize yourself, and it anonymizes where you're at, and it's like a protection to not show where you're being located at, or where your computer is basically located.
So tell us more about how this Silk Road operated. Like who's using it, how are they using it, and what's on the site?
These are hardcore drugs, and you're talking about heroin and cocaine and MDMA, and these are specialized ones. And you would think a website wouldn't be advertising them openly or blatantly, and that was something that stood out right away. Is that Silk Road was essentially like an Amazon where anyone could become a vendor, anyone could be a buyer. You could just sign up, and you could see all these drugs, and you could see everything that was listed just in its, the pictures of it and the description of it and the purity levels. And it was really amazing because they weren't hiding anything. They weren't hiding that they had that. They weren't hiding that they had counterfeit goods. They weren't hiding that they had counterfeit IDs, that they had hacking equipment, things of that nature, just deliberately for sale right on the site.
Winston and Strawn is an international law firm that for more than 170 years has served as a trusted advisor and advocate for clients across virtually every industry. Winston and Strawn's law practice, made up of more than 950 attorneys across 15 global offices, is built on the talent, creativity, and determination of its lawyers and an unwavering commitment to its clients. Winston and Strawn boasts an exceptional financial crimes compliance practice comprised of attorneys who have decades of experience assisting clients with Bank Secrecy Act and anti-money laundering compliance counseling, state and federal enforcement matters, and related investigations. Learn more about the firm's capabilities at winston.com. And so, is this basically what folks call the dark net or a dark net marketplace?
It is. So anything that's Tor because it's behind this wall of protection is typically called a dark net. So anything on Tor is dark net related. There's other types of dark nets, and when you think of a dark net, it's just basically a protection and overlay. And there's other various forms of dark nets, but Tor is one of the easiest to get to and most abundant, I think, that's out there. And these marketplaces that only exist in this world of Tor. So it's something where you can only access it using their program.
So, if I'm a user, exactly how do I do the transaction? How do I pay for these goods and then get them?
The way that Silk Road worked was more on a escrow level. So when we say it that way, it's that you would sign up as a user. The accounts are free. When you get on there, you could see everything that's for sale. And just sort of like Amazon, you would just scroll through the different listings, and then you would click on something that you want. It goes into your shopping cart, and then you pay for it. And the way you pay for it is through this cryptocurrency, primarily through Bitcoin. And the way you do that is you would load your account with Bitcoin, and then you'd have a balance, and then you could do these transactions. When you do the transaction, the funds themselves would transfer internally to the vendor, and once the vendor received the funds, they'd be notified to then ship the goods to the recipient, and you would enter in your shipping address. The vendor would receive that, and then they would send you essentially the drugs, and then the money would be held in escrow, meaning that the website itself, the administrators, the people that were running the website would hold those funds until you then received the goods, and then you would mark it as being received. And once you marked as being received, that would release the funds to the vendor. Now, if you didn't receive it, or you reported that you didn't receive it, there was like a customer service that would then step in and try to arbitrate the issue and either work with the vendor or work with the buyer to resolve the transaction. And you would think that something like that wouldn't work that well because you're behind this layer of an anonymous traffic, and there's really not a better business bureau when it comes to buying illegal drugs, on the internet. So you think that this wouldn't work, but it did work, and surprisingly, it worked really well because it was based on feedback. And so as you see, like, people get like 4 or 5 stars, for whatever, you would see that on Silk Road. They had ratings for all the different vendors, and vendors with really high ratings would survive. Vendors with really low ratings, so if they scammed a lot of people and they didn't ship the goods and they said they shipped it, eventually they get really low ratings, and eventually no one would buy from a really low rated vendor. And same thing, if you had a really low rating as a buyer, a vendor would get credit for that transaction, even if they ship the goods. Like they get the money no matter what type of thing. Like you couldn't pull off too many scams,
Mhm.
in that sort of environment, the way they had it set up. And people would leave comments like, the high was really good, and the stealth on the products of hiding it, in the packaging was superb. Like, really enjoyed, like, the heroin. Thanks. And it was just, it operated like it would any other regular marketplace, but just using explicit goods.
So, who was behind this marketplace?
That's what we didn't know. That's what law enforcement was trying to get to. It took us 2.5 years investigating it, and it took working undercover, and it took working with a number of different agencies, and it took a lot of small pieces coming together. with a lot of effort from a lot of people, and it eventually led to a 29-year-old U.S. citizen that was living in San Francisco. A person by the name of Ross Ulbricht was the individual that was behind this entire website, operating it under the moniker Dread Pirate Roberts, which is from The Princess Bride, if you've seen it, but great '80s movie.
So how did this case unfold? So it seems like it fell into your lap, and you were investigating it for a while. So take us from, once you've identified who's behind it, and then what you did.
Yeah, it was a lot of error, a lot of mistakes along the way. Learning, what you can and can't do with dealing with Tor and dealing with this online undercover work and dealing with cryptocurrency and figuring out all the nuts and bolts and pieces of that because the agency wasn't prepared for this. Like they didn't have the structure in place to really support something of that nature. I mean, the process for doing undercover purchases just wasn't there, and so we were really having to write the book on a lot of the processes in which we were having to do transactions with, in this investigation. And you also found yourself sort of paralyzed in a sense because you had all this authority to send subpoenas out, and that's pretty much the playbook. You send out subpoenas, you do search warrants, you can pretty much leverage probable cause and leverage the evidence that you have to then force other, parties typically to reveal or to do discovery and do it through that mannerism. In this investigation, there wasn't any of that. Like there was no one to subpoena. There wasn't an internet service provider to do a warrant on. You didn't know where the servers were at. So we really had to get creative in trying to figure this out. And the way that it eventually wrapped up was one of the investigators was doing some simple Google searches and came across, someone that reported Silk Road really early on. That, in combination with other evidence that we had already, where we did eventually find the server because there was a misconfiguration in the way that it was being operated, and FBI found that, which then led them to getting a copy of the server. When they looked at the image of the server, they found information that pointed to someone that might have been in San Francisco. At the same time, my investigation in Chicago was working undercover. By that point, I had developed an account that was an administrator on the website. So I was operating as one of the support administrators undercover, working directly for Dread Pirate Roberts. And there was evidence that I was getting from our engagements and chats that also made me believe that this person was in San Francisco. Essentially, they were leaking a time zone through one of their programs. And when we had those small pieces starting to add up, and then eventually we had this name through this individual that was posting about Silk Road really early on before anyone else, and that led us right to Ross Ulbricht. And by the time that we started really looking at him in depth and starting to look at his activity, it really started mirroring and matching exactly who we thought Dread Pirate Roberts was, and that led us to getting a warrant and doing this arrest. It was in 2013 in San Francisco.
So, but before you got to that arrest, I mean, you said you had an account. So, what would you be doing? How would you be interacting with the site and with Ross?
I was originally so it was an account that we took over that was it was a moderator on the forums originally. So Silk Road
Okay.
had forums, and in the capacity, that person worked for Silk Road, and they would respond to different people who had questions about Silk Road, and that was primarily the job of like a moderator was moderating the forums, and you would resolve questions, issues, talk about like how to get to login pages, things of that nature. And so that was primarily my job to begin with, and that transformed though pretty rapidly, where Dread Pirate Roberts would give me additional tasks. So one of those tasks would be, I need you to help me rebuild our wiki page and do a tutorial on how to do pretty good privacy PGP. And so that was something like I'd write the procedure on how to use PGP for the users on Silk Road and do a wiki page on it. And in addition to that, then he had other tasks and things that he was trying to get me to be a more administrator on in the marketplace itself. So there'd be people that would be advertising falsely, or people that would have that weren't a paid vendor that were trying to utilize the website as a platform that's unauthorized. And so he'd have me like monitoring that and like trying to resolve those issues. So it was like a lot of little administrative work, but those were the types of duties and services that I provided as one of his administrators.
Did he think you were a specific person, someone else, like a different identity?
He did. He at that point in time. So this is I took over the account in about early to mid 2013. So a few months before we actually ended up identifying who he was and shutting down the website. And when I took it over, it was from someone that was a previous moderator before. We identified that person and ended up getting them to cooperate and turn over their account to me.
Mm.
So I absorbed that account, which means that I had to absorb that identity too.
Hmm.
Everything from the way they wrote to their knowledge base to their configurations on their computer, pretty
Hmm.
much had to absorb all of that and absorb all their knowledge too, because they were involved in a lot of online chats and different conversations with hundreds of people potentially, and I had to know those stories and know what they talked about and know who they talked to and why they talked to them and who knew you by this username or that username. And um, in order to really fully take over that account and absorb it, that was it was a lot of work.
The site itself, was it just drugs?
No, so it was primarily drugs, but there was counterfeit goods. There was intellectual property rights type of violations. So like the counterfeit stuff, like the Gucci bags, Louis Vuitton. You could find counterfeit IDs, everything from driver's licenses to passports, and the holograms that are being used to for security measures, which is really difficult to find really good quality stuff of that nature. You would really have to know someone to identify half these things, let alone find all this in one spot. Um, they had, in addition to that, hacking equipment, so you could find different coding, you could find services that offered hacking services to get into emails or to get into this account or that account. Tutorials on how to access those as well. So there was different things you could purchase that way. And for a little while, they actually did have weapons on the website. So they had firearms for sale, they had explosives for sale. That later on got moved out to another website called the Armory, and then they shut that down because of the whole Fast and Furious thing. I guess they didn't want the type of heat that would come down from the government with the firearms. The only thing that they were really against was child pornography and counterfeit money. Like
Hmm.
that was pretty much the two things that I guess I was more into like the libertarian stance of Ross Ulbricht and Drew Pirate Roberts that prevented those two things from being on the website.
Hmm.
Um, but there were euthanasia drugs on there. There was organs for sale from time to time,
Wow.
and those were things that were okay to be sold.
Hmm. So you've sort of taken over this account now. Dread Pirate Roberts thinks you're just a regular moderator. Walk us through what you did and what the team did to get to an actual raid.
So we identified him in it was September 11th. Is by the time that they really fell on the radar of us when we were law enforcement was coming together and talking about what little pieces we had, and it took us about a week and a half to really be confident that this is our guy. By September 20th or so, I remember we started drafting up and having our complaint ready to go to file it against Ross Ulbricht as being Dread Pirate Roberts. Um, and the reason I'm giving these dates in 2013 is because the government was also in the process of shutting down. And that was really significant for us.
Right.
And when there's a government shutdown, law enforcement still works if you're considered essential, which we were considered essential, but we
Hmm.
don't get paid.
Hmm.
And regardless of getting paid or not, we also don't have half the services that we normally would have available to us. One of that being travel.
Hmm.
So knowing that we are on the cusp of finally identifying this person who's also become very dangerous by this point, and it wasn't just what they were selling, but Dread Pirate Roberts, Ross Ulbricht, ended up actually commissioning 6 murder for hires as a result of this website, and tried to fulfill one of them earlier in the year. Paid someone off for what they believe they murdered someone, which actually ended up being an undercover agent at the time, and thought they actually did murder someone that was one of his prior admins that was working for him that he thought was stealing from him.
So wait, no, explain what happened. So he thought that he had commissioned a murder, but it didn't happen?
So he did. So he thought that someone did steal from him, and in that process of stealing from him, he thought it was this person, this vendor that used to work for him, and he then tried to go to pay to have this person murdered. The person he tried to pay, though, ended up being another undercover that pretended then to murder this other person, sent some fake photos, and received money from Ross Ulbricht, paying him off for basically killing this person. And then Ross proceeded to brag about it and use that as like influence against his other moderators and admins to say, if you steal from me, I will. This is what will happen to you, essentially. And so he was pretty brazen about that, and he ended up getting, I believe it was threatened again later on, a few months later, where another person that this ended up being a scam. He didn't know it, but
Mhm.
this person said that they essentially were a vendor and they were going to release a lot of the buyers' names out there, and they kept all these when they weren't supposed to keep them.
Hmm.
And Ross decided that it was like justified to try to murder him and his family to protect this. So he went after him by paying off this other person who he thought was part of a biker gang, but it actually ended up being the same person that was threatening to like release all the names, and he ended up paying that person hundreds of thousands of dollars to kill like another like five people essentially, and he got fake photos back and he thought he did those murders too. So I mean, in his mind, he believed he went ahead with all these murders, but in reality, they didn't result in anyone dying.
So at this point, he's basically become a kingpin. The site has grown, but you all know who he is. How did you take him down?
So with the government shutdown, it made it like we were flying out literally on like one-way tickets, and we ended up going out to San Francisco September 30th. It was 2013. Government was shutting down October 1st. That's the new fiscal year, and that's when we had no funds. So we had a skeleton crew. We had a few surveillance agents that were in San Francisco that were monitoring Ross Ulbricht. Myself, another agent from FBI called Chris Tarbell, ended up going out there with our computer scientist, which is Tom Kiernan. And the three of us were pretty much the team that went out to San Francisco. We had another team that was going out to Iceland, which is where the server was located. And the goal was is that we're going to do this type of arrest if it was going to be at his house or somewhere else. That would be followed by a shutdown of the server and capturing the server and getting all the contents off of it. Not really knowing how it was going to play out, we ended up working with the local teams there who were insistent that we're going to do this like really elaborate like SWAT arrest type of style thing at the house, and they're going to send this massive team in and and try to arrest him like in the home where he was living. The only problem with that is that he was living in this three flat and he's living up on the upper floor, and there's multiple people at the house that are living there as well. And we want the laptop. We have a lot of good evidence, but we really want that laptop, and we need the evidence that's going to be out there. And it'd be really good if we had more proof to show that he was exactly Dread Pirate Roberts, so there'd be like no doubt in the minds of anyone else that ever see the evidence that we have that this is the operator of the website. So using my account, we're in a unique position as one of the administrators that I could communicate with him, and that was a goal that I'd be communicating with him during this arrest, and that we'd be able to show that either there'd be communication or a drop off the communication once he was arrested, something to that effect. And it ended up leading us to pretty much winging an arrest that we didn't really plan for, because he ended up leaving his house the following day after we arrived, and as we're monitoring him, he walked into it was a library that was actually just right across the street from where we were staged, away from his home.
Hmm.
And when we saw him go into the library, he ended up having a shoulder bag, and he went inside the library and he opened up a laptop. And on my computer, I could see when Dread Pirate Roberts is online, and he popped up online right as Ross Ulbricht went there and turned his computer on. And I ended up initiating a chat with him as his administrator, asking him to go to an administrative panel that was on Silk Road and asking him basically to look at something for me. And what that did is that caused him to then log in as Dread Pirate Roberts, which is what we wanted.
Hmm.
and then to look at this screen of what I'm trying to point out to him. And in that, he ended up once he was on there, we were pretty confident we had him literally in the library with the keyboard, and had a team that was inside there effect the arrest. And what led to it was some surveillance agents just did a great job of faking a fight in the library, and it got Ulbricht's attention. And when he turned to go watch this fight, another agent walked up and grabbed his laptop and walked it over to our guy Tom Kiernan, and he ended up starting to copy over the directory right there on the spot, like a few feet away from Ulbricht. And um, Ulbricht turns around and sees, no laptop, and then sees this other guy sitting in there with it in his lap, and tried to lunge for it, and ended up getting bear hugged from behind and arrested in the library. And so
Wow.
that was pretty much it. But we caught him literally logged in to the website as Drebhart Robertson. His chat mirrored my chat, which I was doing from outside the library at the time.
Hummingbird is a compliance platform that's reimagining what's possible from financial crime investigations. Teams using Hummingbird work more efficiently and effectively without compromising on quality. Investigators quickly get to the heart of each case with information at their fingertips and compliance grade automation and AI to boost productivity. Designed for essential work in anti money laundering, anti fraud, customer due diligence, and more, Hummingbird allows you to customize the platform to your policies, giving you exactly what you need to get the job done. Hummingbird is determined to fight financial crime by empowering those on the front lines, because financial crime never stops evolving, and neither should the tools you use to stop it. Learn more at hummingbird.co. That's hummingbird.co. So this is in a library. You're nearby, you're online, communicating with him. He's being monitored. I kind of want to know what was the fight? How did they actually stage this? I mean, you don't have too many fights in the library, so how did they set that up?
I mean, it was brilliant. I mean, we didn't talk about this. I mean, it was pretty much just we really did wing this. I mean, in the sense that we know we had the warrant. We were hoping that he'd have his laptop. We didn't really know what was going to happen in the next few minutes, but we did have a plan for generally what we wanted to do for trying to lure him online and get him chatting, and that was sort of the goal for what I was asking him to do in the chat. But once he was there and he was in the library, like, it was pretty brilliant of those people inside. And what I heard is it was a female that pushed another male in his back right corner and basically screamed some expletive, and and it was really loud. And I'm pretty sure, yeah, no one really sees fights in libraries, so it was a great way to get his attention. I mean, I'd be watching it too if I was sitting in the library. Um, so that got his attention long enough for another agent to come up behind him on his blind side, grab the laptop, and walk it over to our computer scientist.
Wow. So what happened to Ross Ulbricht?
Following the arrest, he didn't talk. He cooperated, or sorry, he didn't cooperate. He lawyered up right away. He ended up invoking his rights, which is perfectly okay. But then in the months following, there really was no attempt to proffer. There was no attempt to own up or admit to anything that he did, even though we literally had him logged in, to the administrative panel as Drebhart Roberts. And in his computer, there was just an enormous amount of evidence. I mean, everything from journals to notes to every single like server password that we needed to like get into every single thing that we needed to get into. We identified the other support administrators that were working on the website because he had their photos and he had their identification. And the reason he had that is because he wanted to use that to try to murder them too if they ever stole from him. And so those are things that we found all in his laptop. And so there really was no reason for him to not cooperate or try to get something over, but he really believed that he could pull this off. So he tried to fight it, and he tried to go to court, and he resisted any attempt to try to do any types of pleas of anything else. He ended up getting a superseding indictment after the initial indictment for the Kingpin statute, which is the continuing criminal enterprise statute under 21 USC, which is the narcotics statutes of the United States. And that was something that is a massive um, charge to not just prove, but also the impact of that is a 20-year minimum in the federal system, which is huge. It could come up to a life imprisonment, and they also come with a death sentence if there's anything that shows that anything you did in operating this continued criminal enterprise, which is AKA the kingpin statute.
Mm.
If you're doing anything in that capacity that actually led to any type of murders, then you could get the death sentence too. So he was looking at some very serious charges, not just the continuing criminal enterprise charge.
How long was that sentence?
It didn't take the jury very long. I mean, we went to trial. It was 4 weeks that the government put on pretty much their evidence, and there just was so much evidence. I mean, like we had to limit it down. I testified in that trial and
Mm.
took the jury all of about 30 minutes to find him guilty of all those charges. And he ended up with the sentencing. We were looking at looking at a 20-year minimum, with that continuing criminal enterprise charge. And we didn't really know where it was going to land with the judge. We did show that there was also some wrongful deaths and a few parents that came and testified about kids that overdosed, because one of the arguments that Ulbricht tried to make was like it made it safer for people to get drugs, versus like buying it on the streets, and that no one was harmed as a result of this, And so we showed that there was people harmed. There was at least 6 wrongful deaths, and those were kids. And we had the parents testify, and they came in and talked about their kids. I mean, there was real pain there. There was real loss, and it was highly reckless, and the judge acknowledged that, and the judge also saw what Silk Road in the model of what it was as being a much larger problem, because there was a number of other websites that mirrored that. And so the judge ended up finding him guilty, or sorry, sentenced him to a life in prison, actually two terms life in prison, which in the court system, based upon the number of offenses that he was looking at, he was well over the life sentencing guidelines, especially with that continuing criminal enterprise charge.
Well, Jared, I mean, there's, I know you know this, right? That there's a bit of a free Ross movement out there. There's, a lot of people that have made him a rallying cry. I think, especially for folks in sort of libertarian circles. I mean, you were there. You were in the midst of the case. What do you think about all of that?
If you saw what he did, you actually see the evidence, and you see how he orchestrated himself, and you see what has resulted since then. Just look at the evidence that was presented. You're going to see the true side of him, which he was getting exceptionally dangerous. He was contradicted to everything that he stood for. If you talk about the libertarian movements and free market enterprises, well, he was controlling just as much as any government every single transaction. He was controlling all the activity there. He dictated what his percentages were that he was taking off of everything. Anything that he would say that he stood behind that was a libertarian like type of mentality, he violated. I mean, things such as like he'd say that he couldn't be bought and he couldn't be paid off. Well, he could be, and he absolutely did take bribes. He did take money, and he took people that would provide influence. And he was playing God on the website. And you're talking about also trying to commission murder for hires and paying for them. This isn't just something about like, hey, you could get something, anything you want, and it's your choice to put in your body. There was even an example of a euthanasia drug that was being advertised on there, which really upset me at the time. And it was something that was like it was like a few dollars too. This is something that could stop your heart in an instance, but it was only listed under the chemical name. And it was this really long chemical name, and you didn't know what it was, but it was also listed only under stimulants at the time. And what I was afraid of is some kid or someone else that'd be buying off of there that had, $1 left on their Bitcoin account, and they're looking to buy some type of stimulant. They don't know what's there, and they buy this drug, not knowing this is going to stop their heart. And there's no description over what this is. There's no details on the website. There's no minimum standard on that. And so as one of the administrators, I pointed that out to Ross at the time, and I was like, this needs like a label flag on it. It needs something to say like, hey, this is what this drug is at the very, very least. Like, I'm not even telling you to pull it down. I'm telling you, put a big warning label on it or recategorize it. It's not a stimulant. And he's like, well, how does this fall under our charter? I'm like, our charter? I'm like, what, you want our charter, meaning like having a choice of what you put in your body? I think that falls against the charter, right? And he's like, well, I don't know. At the end of the day, it's really just about money. And he wants to make the money. And he didn't care about putting a warning label up on there. He didn't care about, the one kid that might overdose or die. I even brought that up as an example to him. And so those are things that, when you look at the true Ross and you look at who that person was and you look at everything he did to protect himself. Ultimately, even at the very end, he was only just trying to protect himself, and he still is only just trying to protect himself. He's not doing any good for anyone.
Mm.
I think you see a totally different side of what this storyline is when you just look at the evidence that was presented.
Did your did your eyes meet during the trial when you were testifying? Any acknowledgement or any interaction between the two of you?
When it came to sentencing, I think you might have saw my reaction, even though I was sitting right in front of him when he was trying to um, save himself, even though the parents just got done testifying and they just got done showing pictures of their kids, and these deaths were a result of his website and result of money that he made. And he sort of had the audacity to stand up in court and be like, "I'm really sorry that didn't happen, but I don't think there's been enough talk about me in my life." And it was probably one of the most horrific things I ever heard come out of anyone's mouth. And I think I turned around and looked right at him at the time, um, and just couldn't believe what he said. But that's, again, that just goes to his character and what he was, which is he was someone just trying to save himself.
Wow. Jared, I don't want to take up too much more of your time. I mean, but you've had really, a stellar career. You've done a lot. Anything you can tell us about some of the other cases that you'd like to share?
Yeah, I mean, I ended up following Silk Road. I mean, I didn't get any rest, so I ended up getting lured right into Silk Road 2, which stood up within 3 days of us shutting down that marketplace. And my account at the time that was undercover didn't get exposed, so I ended up being brought into that next website, and ended up working for that administrator, who also absorbed a Dread Pirate Roberts name for a little while, and worked for them for a whole another year until we identified who they were. And we identified that person who was also living in San Francisco, and arrested that person and shut down Silk Road 2 in the following year. But that was a whole another year staying undercover, working every single night, doing customer support, vendor support,
Hmm.
on that marketplace, and ended up, hopefully, like, we thought we got to that, and we shut down. Um, it was 6 other markets at the same time in what we called Operation Animus. We did that through Europol, and Silk Road 2 was one of them. And we got a few other black markets at the same time.
So that amount of time undercover, what's that like?
It's pretty terrible. It's you're still working full time. I'm still running cases out of the RAC O'Hare, the resident agent in charge, office, and I'm still balancing 16, 17 other cases on top of Silk Road and the discovery that's going to Silk Road 1, and you're working undercover still, and it's a full-time job. It's more than a full-time job. I'm online pretty much from 6 a.m. until 3 a.m. or 4 a.m. And I'm doing all the different customer support, vendor support, and engaging and documenting all this evidence, while also still working, physically going into work and physically going up and doing other things, and pretty much just having a laptop tied to me,
Hmm.
for a better of a year and a half, everywhere where I went. And so it became so draining by the end of Silk Road 2. And I was also working at Europol in
Hmm.
2014, towards the end of it all, that I actually had walking pneumonia. I was like almost on my deathbed at the sense, because I was just not sleeping and just under so much stress.
Hmm. So, what did you do to deal with that stress over that amount of time? How do you cope?
I think you do what you see on top of my head right now, which is just grow a lot of grays. Like, there really wasn't any structure set up for that. I mean, Homeland Security wasn't really set up to handle something like that in nature. I mean, I was being paid in Bitcoin from Silk Road 1 to Silk Road 2, and it was really a full time job, and it was taking up this identity, and living this identity every single day, while at the same time trying to do your job. And so it was a lot of stress during that time frame. It took a lot of time to unwind, following the Silk Road 2 takedown, and then Silk Road 2 happened in November 2014. We went to trial with Ross Ulbricht in January 2015, and trial didn't really wrap up, and the sentencing wasn't until later in 2015. And so I was still um, just trying to recover from everything, when I also was approached on another investigation called Kick-Ass Torrance, and working that. So I put all my effort right back into that for a whole another year, and that was a nice shift because I didn't have to work undercover, and ended up just focusing on that website.
All the stress. I mean, looking back, was it worth it?
100%. 100%. I mean, I think I mean, the day that we identified Ulbricht and when we got there, like, we still couldn't really believe, even though, like, we're super confident this is who we had, and we had the criminal complaint, and this is we were sure this is the right person. And then when you arrest them and you see it is the right person, 100%, you're like, this is amazing. And we got the seizure banner up, and we have this laptop that's being worked on, from an evidence standard. But taking that sitting down and finally just taking that first breath, because it felt like we were holding our breath for about 2 years. And that amount of relief was enormous, because at the time, that website, what it was is it was something that you could see and that you could touch, but you really couldn't do anything with, and we felt powerless, looking at it. And it was something that kept me up, because it had, with the weapons on there, you had school shootings going on, and you had other things going on at the same time too. Newtown happened in the middle of all that, and just being petrified that there's something like that that's out there that just makes everything so simple to get, and you feel responsible for shutting this thing down. I mean, even to the point that one of the parents that testified, I didn't even know this till sentencing, when I was sitting there listening to him. One of the parents that testified about their son Brian that died on the website, and he ended up buying drugs the day that we shut down the website, and it was heroin, and he ended up dying 3 days later from an overdose on it. And for me, that was enormous. I'm still devastated to this day, knowing that 2.5 years of working on this thing, like, tirelessly, and how fast we went at the very end to try to get to him and arrest him, and we were literally just one day short of preventing a life, preventing that pain that you hear that father's voice. And so the whole thing was really impactful, and it absolutely was worth it.
This interview with Jared Der-Yeghiayan makes me think about a quote from one of the favorite rap groups from my youth, Boogie Down Productions. Real bad boys move in silence. Jared, as you can tell, is not boisterous about his accomplishments. I mean, the guy runs 100-mile marathons and speaks about them humbly, almost reluctantly. He takes a similar approach about his time as an agent. But the effort, the precision, and tenacity that was required for him to aid in taking down the Silk Road should certainly be acknowledged. It's that quality of humility that you'll find in the most dedicated fighters of financial crime, because they are the heroes who don't get headlines. To do that sort of work and to do it well, one can't be in it for the exposure or the publicity. I'm thankful that Jared took the time to tell me his story so we could share it with you. Please share this with those you know. I'm Yaya Jata Fanusie, and this is Designated on the Illicit Edge Network.